Okay, ready, Patty boy? Here's something, all you need to know for these arches, these pouches, clefts, and arches, okay? So first of all, very simple. Pouches, you'll probably never have to know, but pouches are on the inside, clefts are on the outside. Very few things you have to know with the clefts, and arches, obviously, the center part, okay? So the arches are probably what they're going to ask you about because those are where the artery, the cartilage, the nerve come from. So when they're asking the derivative of something, majority of the time, it's asking about the arch. Almost never are they going to be asking anything about a fucking pouch. Okay, so the cleft is the outside structure. The only time they're going to ask about the cleft, which you probably already know, is brachial cyst or external auditory tubes. Remember, brachial cyst are if they're on the lateral side of the neck along the anterior surface of the sternocleidomastoid. If it's ever in midline, that's going to be a thyroglossal duct cyst. Okay, so now the important part, the shit that is hard to remember. Where do the nerves, arteries, and cartilage come from for these arches? Well, I'm telling you now, it's actually way easier than you think. First of all, you know the cranial nerves, OOOs, to touch and feel, blah, blah, blah. So notice how the derivatives of the arches are only the ones that do both sensory and motor. None of the other ones that are purely sensory or sensory motor come from an arch, okay? On top of that, they go in order. So 5, transgeminal, is 1. 2 is facial. 3 is glossopharyngeal. And then 4 and 6 are the vagus nerve, okay? So now, as long as we know that, we know everything else. Why? Because it all makes sense. First arch, trigeminal nerve. Well, what does a trigeminal nerve do? Well, I know that it has the mandibular division, so it does, what does the mandibular do? And trigeminal, the muscle, chewing. Muscles of mastification, the mandible itself, and the maxillary artery. Maxillary artery supplies half the shit to that area of muscle mastification and end of the face and shit like that, okay? So trigeminal. Second arch, we have the facial nerve. Second, facial. Well, what does the facial nerve do? Well, I know that it does the muscles of facial expression. I know it innervates those. And I know that if in hyperacoustia, that's from the stapedius bone. By the way, incus malleus come from here. Stapedius bone, hyperacoustia, important. The upper part of the hyoid bone. And the stapedial artery. Well, if it gives stapedius bone, I guarantee it gives me stapedial artery. So, once again, makes sense. Facial nerve, muscle facial expression, stapedius bone, stapedial artery, hyoid bone. Okay, now the next one, glossopharyngeal. Once again, both. What does the glossopharyngeal nerve do? Well, stylopharyngeus, which, I mean, probably never going to ask you about it anyways, but technically something with talking, I'm pretty sure that's what it does. The lower half of the hyoid bone, which makes sense. Okay, the common carotid and the proximal internal carotid. Well, don't you remember the baroreceptors, the carotid baroreceptor? What's the nerve that comes off the carotid baroreceptor? Well, pretty sure that's the glossopharyngeal nerve, right? So, probably the questions they're going to ask you there, common carotid, glossopharyngeal nerve, proximal internal carotid. Stylopharyngeus, lesser half of the hyoid, not as important, can remember it still. Okay, well, fourth one is the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve, well, I wonder what the vagus nerve does. I know it's important in swallowing and my gag reflex and shit, so it's going to be my muscles of my soft palate, except for the tensor valley palatine, and the muscles of the pharynx, except for the cricothyroid. Now I'll tell you why you can easily remember that one in a second. Well, what arteries? Well, arch of the aorta. With a baroreceptor in the arch of the aorta responds with what nerve? I can't remember. Oh, I think it's the vagus nerve and the proximal subclavian. Proximal subclavian, I would just remember, comes off the arch of the aorta. Okay, so last but not least, 6th arch. Oh, there's no more left. What are we supposed to do? Oh, that's because the vagus nerve gets both two arches. And what specifically? The recurrent laryngeal branch of the vagus nerve. Well, if you remember, the recurrent laryngeal branch causes what? Hoarseness of voice. So I wonder what that's important for my voice. So it gives off the proximal pulmonary arteries. Don't have one for you for there, or the ductus arteriosus. Don't have one for you there. But it gives me to the intrinsic laryngeal muscles and the skeletal muscles of the esophagus, once again, talking, and except for the cricothyroid. Now, here's what they're going to try to trick you. They're going to ask you about this cricothyroid, and they're going to say, does it come off the fourth or for the sixth? But if you can remember from anatomy, the recurrent laryngeal nerve supplies everything in the pharynx except for the cricothyroid, which comes off the branch of the vagus nerve still, but it is the external pharyngeal branch or some shit. I just know it's external. I forgot exactly which one. But either way, the recurrent laryngeal nerve supplies all of that shit, so except for the cricothyroid. So that's how you should know. Vagus fourth arch does the cricothyroid. Sixth arch recurrent laryngeal branch of the vagus nerve does the cricothyroid. Also, the fourth and the sixth do almost all the cartilage of the thyroid, the cricoid cartilage, or tenured cutiform. It's both of these arches, okay? So that's my easy way to remember most of the stuff they're going to ask you. Anything else they ask you beyond that, too much.